pray that your Spirit would be upon us. Help us to be hearers of your word. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, thank you, Jason. All right. You can go ahead and turn into your Bibles to Exodus, where we are today. We are going to be covering the first 15 chapters. I asked you guys to read chapter 20, so that's the 10 Commandment chapter. There's a reason why. We need to understand the Exodus, even though it is a going out. That's what the word means, a going out. It is not going out to nothing. This is the important aspect of the Christian life and what it is that Israel is asking, God is asking of Israel, but it's also the same thing that God asked of Abraham. He doesn't just call us out from something, he calls us to something. And what he's going to call the nation to are the 10 Commandments and the covenant that is going to be made between them and God at Mount Sinai. Reading ahead, if you are able to, will pay off big dividends next week because it'll give you a jump start as we go into the tabernacle. And if God gives you eyes to see when we go into the tabernacle, every single detail of the tabernacle talks about Jesus. And we are going to try to go as fast as we can in a lot of areas so we can slow down in chapters 25 and 26 and into 27. But today we have 15 extremely dense chapters ahead of us. These are chapters that we could slow down, and we did. When we studied it in our verse-by-verse on Sunday, we took our time because there's just so many things going on here in the beginning of it. So we're going to jump right in, starting with chapter 1, and see how it is that God is going to bring his people out. And it starts in the first couple of verses with a prelude, but it's essentially, this is how we got here. This is where we're at. It's a prelude of history of Israel in Egypt, and it's a recap of Jacob and the family that came to Egypt in that group of 70 people. And the conclusion of that bringing into the land is then expressed in 5 different ways, all in verse 7. It's like God just wants to make sure that we understand what it is that he's saying, or what he's saying. So we're told that Israel became fruitful, increased greatly, multiplied, became exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. 5 ways to say the exact same thing. There were so many people. Later on, we'll see the number of people, the approximate number of males that are coming out, and we're told it's 600,000. If we take very conservative numbers and say that for every man that's counted in this particular count, there was one woman or child, then we're looking at 1.2 million people coming out of Egypt at that time. If we look at a more realistic number, and say this is how many we need just to keep the nation going, then for every man you have a woman, and then for every man and woman you have a child. That puts us in the realm of 2.4 million people in the nation over the course of 400 years. They became fruitful, they increased greatly, they multiplied, became mighty, and the land was filled with them. And then verses 8 through 16, we have the Pharaoh responding to this growth of people. Now, we're told that a new king arose who did not know Joseph, did not know what Joseph did for the people. And the way that Genesis ends, there's this almost like unrepayable debt that the nation owes to what it is that Joseph did to keep them all going. But eventually there arose this new king, and there's many different theories. We don't have time to go into it. But there's different theories as to why he didn't know Joseph or didn't know the legacy of the Jewish people in the land. But then he makes a decision out of fear. There's so many of them, we got to do something about this. So his solution is let's appoint taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor. So it appears that perhaps they weren't in servitude at that time, but now, because they have the army in the land, they're going to appoint these taskmasters, so these are Egyptians, over them to oppress them. But the plan backfires. The more they afflict them, the more they multiply. We're going to see the same thing later on in the Acts of the Apostles, because the more that Satan tries to oppress the church and persecute the church, the more it spreads. Because once a fire is rolling, the last thing you want to do is try to stomp it out. It's too late for that. You can try to smother it. You can try to mix it with something and compromising it, but just stomping it out with your feet is not going to help the sparks keep spreading. So that's the first plan, to afflict them. The second plan is to convince the Hebrew midwives, so their own people, to kill the infant boys as they're being born. One of the students in the Tuesday session pointed out beautifully that this is the first government-mandated abortion in the Bible. And it's going to be powerfully bookended by a contrast later on when we see how it is that God protects the children. But this is what the government responds with. The first one, let's oppress them. The second one, let's kill all the boys, the ones who are likely to lead an army against us and to have an insurrection. But we're told in verse 17, the midwives feared God rather than Pharaoh, did not do as what was commanded them. And because they feared God, we're told he establishes houses for them. Now hold on to that thought, because that's going to be the central heart through the entire law. The fear of the Lord allows him to establish a house for you. He wants to bless you. He wants to take you to a land that you could not get on your own. You can't even escape the place that you are on your own. But he wants to take you there, but it starts with this, the fear of the Lord. That's why the fear of the Lord is beginning of wisdom. So now comes the third plan. First one, to oppress. Second one is kill all the boys right at birth. The third plan is we're going to kill every son by throwing the sons into the Nile. That's verse 22. But the girls can live. Again, there's different theories as to why there is this pressure on the boys. Now we know, going back to the garden, why. Because Satan understands it's going to be the seed of woman, and it's going to be this male figure. He will do this to you. He's going to bruise your head. So we know that there's this demonic element to it, but there's other possible ways that maybe Satan planted that idea within the nation. And I'll let you guys research that on your own. But that's how chapter 1 ends. It begins with this huge blessing on Israel, and then it ends with this incredible persecution of the people. But then a deliverer is born. In chapter 2, we're told that Moses is born. He's from the line of Levi, and Jochebed, his mother, hides Moses for 3 months because he was beautiful. Now, who wrote that line? Moses. Later on, he's also going to write that I was the most humble person in the entire world. But just so you know, before I was humble, I was beautiful. But she hides him. She hides him for 3 months because he is beautiful, that she couldn't have bared to do this thing to him. So she hid him as long as she possibly could. But at 3 months, she could no longer hide him. His cries would have been too loud. His energy would have been hard to hide. So what she does is she builds a basket. And the Hebrew word for basket is the same word as ark in Genesis chapter 6. And she treats it the same way. She builds this ark for him, and she coats it inside and out with tar and pitch. It's making it waterproof. It's going in the Nile. And then what she does is she sets this basket among the reeds on the bank of the Nile. Now, if you're like me, you grew up with the movie The Ten Commandments. And as far as you're concerned, Moses looks like Charlton Heston, and if I get up there and he doesn't, I won't recognize him because that's what he should look like. But again, if you're like me, and this movie was so informative in your head when it came to these kind of Bible studies, you have this image of them floating the ark down the Nile and Miriam running along the bank to kind of see where it was going to go, but that's not what happens. What happens is that Jochebed goes and she takes it in a specific place and she places it in the reed so it won't float away. It makes sense that she knew this is where Pharaoh's daughter, the princess, would come to bathe, so she puts it there where she will come to it. Now, how she knew that the princess would have this kind of response, we have no idea. Maybe it was just something God put on her heart, or maybe she knew that she has a heart for the people. She sees what's going on, and it's not going to sit well with her. But whatever the reason, she puts it there. The Pharaoh's daughter comes down to bathe. Miriam's standing at a distance to see what would happen. And as Pharaoh's daughter came down, she saw the basket and had a servant bring it to her. When she opens the basket, just so happens Moses cries, and she feels pity for the child. Now, we're told that she knows this is a Hebrew child. We have no idea for sure how she knew. Was it just his features were so different? Is it like the movie because there was a blanket in there, there was a Hebrew pattern? We don't know. But it sparks all these new questions. If he was identifiable by his outward features to be a Hebrew, then how did Pharaoh allow this boy into his court to eventually become in line to be the next Pharaoh? That's what we know from the New Testament. In any case, she has pity on him. Miriam comes forward and offers to get a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. Miriam brings Jochebed to Pharaoh's daughter, and she's allowed to nurse the child, which she would nurse Moses until he was weaned, so 2 to 3 years old. She's going to have several years with him, and this slave is going to be paid a wage for her service. Now, here's all new questions. Since when did you start paying the slaves? But this is a double on top of blessing for Jochebed. She didn't listen to the Pharaoh's command. She saved the child, and she trusted the child in this incredible situation, and God would bless her so much. We're told that Moses is adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, and he is named Moses because I drew him out of the water. Now, here's all new series of questions. Why the word Moses? Because it's either a Hebrew name, and she knowingly did it, and then why is she naming him a Hebrew name if he's going into the Egyptian court? And if it's an Egyptian name, then why did the Israelites call him Moses? Why didn't they call him something else? I mean, Daniel had Daniel, and then he had the name that Nebuchadnezzar changed his name to. Here's the neat thing about the word Moses. Remember, they've been in Egypt for about 400 years now. It's a Semitic word that likely has Egyptian roots. It's a word they picked up while they were in Egypt. And this name that goes over both cultures is what he is named, is what he will be known by. We see in verses 11 through 15 that Moses flees Egypt because as he looked upon his brethren, and it implies an understanding that he knew these were his brethren. We'll see it later on in the New Testament as well. He supposed, why didn't they know that I would be the one to deliver them? But he sees their hard labors, and then he sees an Egyptian who is beating a Hebrew, and he goes up and he kills the Egyptian. Now, it's a powerful response. It speaks to several things all at once. One, Moses was no wimp. He was strong enough to go and take on a hardened taskmaster who would not have been a wimp himself and to kill him with his bare hands. But it also shows his heart to go and protect those who could not protect themselves. And it says several times in this passage that these were his brethren. So again, we go, how does he know? And it makes sense that because his mother had him for 3 years, she had 3 years to pour God into him, who he was, who his people were. Word spreads, as word always does, and Pharaoh hears about the killing, and he tries to kill Moses. So Moses flees. He goes to Midian, so he has to go across an entire body of water. And then when he gets over to Midian, which is on the that eastern side of the peninsula across from him, he goes and sits down by a well. Now, if you're keeping count, we already have several very important wells throughout the Bible. We have Hagar, Genesis 21, when God finds her when she runs from Sarah. Abraham's servant, when he goes and he comes in contact with Rebekah, Genesis 24. Jacob in Genesis 29, and he has several wells. And now we have Moses here. And it's a place of being found. He's going to eventually be brought into Reuel's house. And what happens is when he gets there and he's just kind of passed out by the well and trying to figure out what to do, the daughters of Reuel start coming. Reuel, also called Jethro, but Reuel seems to be a title name or his priest name. We're not really sure. But his daughters come up to the well, and the other shepherds start to push them out of the way to feed their own animals first. Well, that flies all over Moses because, again, we've already established he is one who protects the weak. So he goes and beats up all the other guys, and then he personally waters the sheep, and the daughters respond by leaving him at the well. And they go home, and he's like, how'd you get here so fast? And they're like, oh, this Egyptian protected us. And he was like, you left him at the well? So they go and they bring him. He comes into the home of Jethro, and he will go on to marry Zipporah, and they will have a child together named Gershom, which means foreigner. He says, his name is Gershom because I am a foreigner, a sojourner in a foreign land. Now, this is interesting. He's going to have 2 sons. Only one of them receives a name right now. The other one will get a name way after they come out of the Exodus altogether. Eventually, we're told near the end of the chapter that the king who hunted Moses and possibly was the one who brought about the oppression of Israel, he dies. And the sons of Israel cry out for help. It's an interesting transition point because, again, what it's communicating is that they understand that even though the Pharaoh was dead, our oppression goes on. The next one's going to do the same thing, and we will definitely see that as we continue through the book. But God hears their groaning, and we're told he remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, super important to understand this now. It's just like Noah in the flood. And God remembered Noah. It's not that God forgot. Oh, yeah, I had these people in Egypt. I said I was going to do something with them. What was it? It's not what happens. The idea is that God was remembered by them. And because he is remembered by them, because now they're crying out to him, he can lean into the covenant that he made with them. He never forgot. He leaned into the covenant that they forgot, but he never forgets. He remembered what they forgot. He remembered the covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God goes and he calls the deliverer, chapter 3. He calls to Moses, and Moses is tending flocks on the west side of the wilderness. It's backside of the desert in the King James Version. And for those with old Calvary roots, you remember about Pastor Chuck talking about your BSD degree, your backside of the desert degree, that sometimes God can't use you until after he strips everything away from you. And then he can take the remains and make something out of that. And that's what's going on with Moses here. He will spend 40 years in the backside of the desert. And while he's working with the sheep, now remember, he came out of Egypt. We know from the end of Genesis that shepherding was a job that was abhorrent to the Egyptians. It was disgusting to them. And him, a former prince of Egypt who was in line to be Pharaoh, is now out there tending sheep. But he's out there tending sheep, and we're told that he's doing this by Horeb, the mountain of God, which is Mount Sinai. We'll learn that later on in Deuteronomy chapter 4. But as he is around the base of the mountain, we're told that an angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire or a blazing fire. But pay attention to what's going on. God is not the bush. He didn't appear as the bush, and he did not appear as the fire either. We're told that the angel was in the fire. Almost every word-for-word English translation translate the phrases in the flame. And the idea that the translators were trying to express was God was not the bush nor the flame, but he was with the bush in the fire. And even though the bush was on fire, it was not consumed. Now, this is just dripping with imagery. Because in this moment, the bush is a symbol for Israel. We'll see it later on with the prophets quite a bit. And Israel was being consumed. It was oppressed. It was on fire, but it was not consumed. And the reason that it was not consumed was God was with them inside of the fire. It's what we'll see later on in the book of Daniel with 3 Jewish boys who were thrown into a fiery furnace, and someone that with the appearance of the Son of God is in there. And then later on in the book of Job, when God goes and he finally speaks to Job, we're told that God speaks from out of the whirlwind. God is not the whirlwind, but the whirlwind where Job found himself, God was in the midst of that. Moses specifically goes to see this bush because the bush was not consumed. When God sees Moses turn aside, he calls Moses by name, and Moses answers, "Here I am." So God tells him, take off your shoes, take off your sandals, for where you are is holy ground. Now, I don't know about your kids, but our kids went through a phase where they loved to wear sandals or Crocs all the time. You couldn't get them into closed-toed shoes. And you know, if your kids were like that, then when they took those sandals off, those were the dirtiest, nasty little feet. I mean, there was stuff all growing between their toes. And the last thing you wanted to tell them was, take your shoes off because the floor is clean. No, keep those on until we can clean your feet off. So why would God say, Moses, take your sandals off? This is holy ground. It's the same thing that we're going to see later on in the upper room with the disciples when Jesus takes off his outer robe, wraps himself a towel, and he washes the feet of the disciples. And he gets to Peter, and Peter goes, you're not going to wash my feet. Well, then you have no part with me. Then wash all of me, my Lord. He goes, no, just your feet. That's all I need to do. If I do your feet, you'll be clean. That's what's happening to Moses here. He's on holy ground, so God tells him to take off his sandals because the moment Moses makes contact with the holy ground of God, Moses doesn't make the ground dirty. God makes a dirty man clean. And this becomes part of the sanctification process, and all he has to do is draw close to God. He doesn't have to clean his feet up first. Just take your sandals off, Moses. Come spend time with me. God declares that he is the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, so he's identifying himself. He identified Moses already. He calls him Moses. Then he says, this is who I am. And then he says, I have seen the affliction of the people. And this becomes the heart of all the books from Exodus through Deuteronomy, but especially of Exodus. He's going to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians and to a good and spacious land flowing with milk and honey. And that from and to is so important in this book. And in order to effect this deliverance, God is going to send Moses to confront Pharaoh, and Moses' response is to give 5 protests. The first protest is what we see in verses 11 through 12. Who am I? Who am I that I would go and say this before Pharaoh? At one point, he thought that people should have understood that he would be the one to free them. It's what Stephen says in Acts chapter 7. Now, 40 years later, he's not even willing to approach Pharaoh at all. And God says, I will be with you. He doesn't go, this is who you are, Moses. He goes, this is who I am, and who I am is the one who will go with you. So who Moses is the one whose God goes with him. That's who you are. Protest number 2. Moses changes the question then to, well, who are you? It started with, who am I? Now it's, who are you? And Moses presents this as, what will I say when they ask for your name? And God responds by giving him his covenant name. YHWH, Yahweh, I am. Now this is special. This is important. Because this particular word is used all throughout Genesis. Again, it's one of the great questions that came out of the Tuesday session. Well, what did Abraham and Isaac and Jacob all call the Lord? Because we see the word Lord, that when it's all in caps like that, that's referring to Yahweh, the tetragrammaton. But in Exodus, God will tell Moses, listen, I didn't tell anyone else my covenant name. I'm only telling you guys because you're the ones I'm going to make the covenant with. This is a special moment of revelation that is going to be given to Moses and given to Israel by virtue of the covenant. And what he's saying to them is, I am God, the self-existent one. Because we all exist because we were created. He exists because he exists. And it invokes the idea of Genesis 1:1, before the beginning was, God already is. He reassures Moses, the people will listen to you when you go to Pharaoh, so don't worry about it, but Pharaoh will not listen to you. He's setting up for the disappointment that is to come before very long. And God tells Moses, when he doesn't listen to you, I'm going to force him to let you go. And when you do, you're going to plunder the Egyptians on the way out. Protest number 3. Moses resists by claiming, well, now, the people are the problem. First it's, who am I? Then it's, who are you? And then it's, oh, it's them, the people, they're going to be the issue. And he goes, what if they don't believe me? So God responds by giving him the ability to do 2 primary signs and then 1 backup sign. The first one is take your staff, throw it on the ground, and it becomes a snake. And we know this is a real snake and not just a statue of a snake, because it starts moving and Moses starts running. So it tells us it's a real snake. And then the second one is take your hand and put it inside your cloak and bring it out. It's leprous, put it back, and it becomes clean. And man, that seems like a really weird one. I mean, the staff to snake thing is pretty impressive. Yeah, we can understand that. But what's all this stuff about leprosy? Again, it implies a couple things. One is that they understood from a distance what a leprous hand looked like, and they understood it was a disease you could not cure. But here's the other thing for us as Christians we need to start understanding. What it declares is that God has the authority to say that something is unclean and something is clean. And God alone has the power to take something that is sinful and unclean into something that is clean. And that's what he's going to do with the people over the course of their wilderness wandering. He's going to take an unclean people, and by the end of it, he's going to declare them righteous as they go into the promised land. Then he tells them, some will believe the first, some will believe the second, but if they believe neither, which is what's going to happen with Pharaoh, then here's your backup sign. You're going to take some of the water from the Nile, you're going to pour it onto dry ground, and it'll become as blood. Okay. Protest number 4. Moses says, well, the issue's still me. I'm not an eloquent man. I'm unable to speak clearly before others. And God responds with, who has made men's mouth? So then Moses gives his Hail Mary, and it's not really much of an excuse. It's more just a complaint. In verse 3, he goes, just send anybody else. Now, we're told in verse 14, after his send anybody else, that the anger of the Lord burned against Moses. It's an extremely dangerous place. And it's an interesting play on words, because what caused Moses to draw aside? A flame that did not consume. And now God is burning against Moses. God is a fire that will consume. Moses has a chance for obedience. It's a dangerous place for him, though, if he leans away, yet God is still so gentle with Moses, and he goes, you know what, I'm going to provide you a help. And he says, your brother is well spoken. Moreover, your brother is coming to see you, and you will teach him what to say. I'll teach you what to say, you teach him what to say, and then together you will go forward. But here's the interesting thing. If this is chronological here in this chapter, Aaron hasn't left yet. He won't leave until verse 27 of this same chapter when God says, go see your brother. God is talking about a future event in the past tense, like it's already completed. because that's the certainty with which he moves. And it allows us to understand all these things. The people will believe you, Pharaoh will not, but I'll make him let you go. All of those things have the same certainty as Aaron coming to his brother. So Moses does what he's commanded. He goes to his father-in-law, to Jethro, because he's still in his house. He has to ask for permission to leave. It's the polite thing to do. And Jethro goes, if this is the word of the Lord, who am I to say no, go? But on his way toward Egypt, in verse 24, we're told that the Lord confronts Moses and sought to put Moses to death. Now, the issue appears to be that the sons are not circumcised. But Moses knew they were supposed to be circumcised. Remember, he was with his mother at the beginning for 3 months. Jewish boys were circumcised on the 8th day, so he had already been circumcised. But it appears when he was with the Midians that he did not circumcise his child, at least Gershom. He's the only one who's named. And the word used for son is very specific. It's singular. It's only referring to one kid. And it's likely the second child is already born by this point because he'll kind of be separated from his wife for a while during everything that's going on with the plagues. And by the time he comes back and his father-in-law brings a family, both the kids are there. But I digress. It seems likely that the reason that Gershom was not circumcised was Zipporah. It wasn't their ways, it wasn't their customs, and Moses didn't push it because he's not living with the Hebrews anymore. When in Rome, do as the Romans. But he is now going to lead a Jewish nation out of bondage and to the land promised to Abraham. You might think that the covenant of circumcision given to Abraham might be something important. He should have had the child circumcised before they went. But here's the overall lesson. Moses cannot lead the nation in a righteousness he is not willing to live himself. And this is a super important concept for Moses going forward. But God will come against him, and we're told that God moves to kill him. It puts his life in serious danger, and because Zipporah is the one who goes and does the circumcision and seems to be very upset about it, she flings the foreskin at him and says, you're a husband of blood to me. It appears that Moses is incapacitated, could not do it himself. Zipporah had to do it, so it is the movement of her heart that had to be broken in order for them to do what they were going to be called to do. Moses goes on to meet with Aaron, and he meets with the elders of Israel. He tells them the words of the Lord, shows them the signs, and the people believe. They respond by worshiping God. Great. Easy part done. Let's go on to Pharaoh. Moses and Aaron go before Pharaoh, and they approach him and ask for the Israelites to be able to go a 3 days journey. Remember that. 3 days journey into the wilderness to celebrate a feast to God. Now, again, if you're taking count, we have all these 3 days in the life of Abraham, 3 days in the life of Isaac, 3 days in the life of Jacob, 3 days in the life of Joseph, now 3 days in the life of the nation of Israel as a whole. But that 3 days will become important later on. Let's go into the wilderness let us go to celebrate a feast to God. And Pharaoh responds this way, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? And then he builds on this in verse 2, because that's bad enough. He says, I do not the Lord, and besides, so what he's saying is, I don't know the Lord, and even if I did, I wouldn't let his people go. Now consider just the chutzpah of the heart to say this. Pharaoh tells Moses not to interrupt the people in their labors. So after Moses and Aaron goes away, what he does is he summons the taskmasters, that's the Egyptians, and the foremen. Now the foremen were Hebrews that are assigned over the people. And he tells them, you're no longer to provide straw for the Israelites in their making of bricks. They must gather their own straw, but do not lower the daily quota of bricks that they have to make at all. Now, this essentially doubles their work, if not a little bit more. God speaks to Moses after the first confrontation regarding the response of Pharaoh, and he says, I was waiting for this response from Pharaoh. All right, now you're going to see what I'm going to do to Pharaoh. And this tells us God understood this was happening. We already know that. He said that, but he's saying, I was waiting for this response. Now, watch what happens. God tells Moses to tell the Israelites he's going to deliver them. They need this word because they just had their work doubled. They had this real high, all right, great, God's with us, he's going to get us out of here, and then what's the response? Our work gets doubled. He says, go remind them of what I'm going to do. And verse 7 shows the relationship the nation was to have to God. And this reminder of deliverance, I am the God who delivered you from Egypt, will be repeated throughout the history of Israel, all the way until the coming of Jesus. But this idea will be repeated throughout their history and through all of the prophets. Moses is told to go back to Pharaoh. Tell him to let the sons of Israel go out of the land. God then formally charges them to speak to the Israelites and to Pharaoh to tell him to bring the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt. And this adds weight to the command. It has the feeling in this particular moment that if Moses is not faithful, the Israelites will not be set free. Then in verses 14 through 27, we have this genealogy that seems to pop out of nowhere, but it's very intentional. What it does is it goes all the way down to show the genealogy of Moses and Aaron. So it goes through the oldest kid, then the second oldest kid of Jacob, then it goes to Levi, which was the third oldest, then it starts to break down through the family, and it touches on Moses, and it keeps going. Because the emphasis of the genealogy is not Moses, despite as much as we love Moses. It's on the family of the future high priest, Aaron, and the sons who will be part of that high priestly line. Then it refers back to Moses as confirmation that these are the two commanded to speak to Pharaoh. So God keeps going. He tells Moses what will happen. After repeating the charge to Moses and Aaron, God tells Moses what to expect. And he tells Moses, I'm going to establish a hierarchy. And just like I am to you in the nation, you're going to be like this with Aaron and with Pharaoh. But the words will not be received because God will ultimately harden the heart of Pharaoh. Now, please pay attention. We need to understand this one big time. When we read that God will harden the heart of Pharaoh, it is not that God will take away the choice of Pharaoh, but that God will solidify in Pharaoh's heart the decision that Pharaoh has already made. This is why it's so important to see what God does, and that he does not at all harden the heart of Pharaoh until plague 6. And by the time we get to plague 6, Pharaoh's already hardened his own heart like 7 times. And then God hardens his heart at plague 6, but then he doesn't for plague 7. Again, it's Pharaoh's total choice. But plague 7 becomes the confirmation of what Pharaoh has already desired. He has already put his heart upon wickedness, and after a moment, God says, you can't turn back now. I will harden your heart so that you must receive the judgment that your decisions have warranted. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart will be the opportunity for God to show the world his signs and wonders. So God tells Moses what to do. He gives him instruction for the staff, especially that Aaron was supposed to do this. He's going to throw it down to the ground. We're going to have the staff to snake encounter. And Moses and Aaron do what he says. And he throws the staff down. It becomes a snake. It's super impressive. So what does Pharaoh do? He goes and he calls some of the magicians of the court, and they come forward, and they do the same thing. Now, it shows us Satan does have ability. And he does have the ability to confer some of that ability onto his people. So we should not be amazed when the enemy is able to do some of the things that he does. But again, there's a pecking order. And the implication is that they have multiple snakes here. But then the snake that came from the staff with Moses and Aaron then go, and it devours all of the other ones until they're all gone, and then it appears like nothing was left. It swallowed them up, showing the superiority of the God of Moses and Aaron. And then we're told in verse 13, look at it if you have it open, verse 13, that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. It is some response to everything that just happened with the snake. And it's the first mention of Pharaoh hardening his own heart. But the way that the Hebrew word is sitting there, what the implication is, when that Pharaoh saw the thing with the staff and Moses' snake ate all the other one's snake, is that his heart was starting to be softened like he was leaning forward. Like he was starting to bend a little bit. And when he hardens, he pushes back against the direction that he was going. Like a wind was causing him to press down, and he stiffens himself against the wind and will not bend down. It's the first indication that this is going on. Moses and Aaron report back to God about what's happening, and Moses is told to go to Pharaoh in the morning when he's going through the Nile. Now, I want you to pay attention to that phrase, in the morning. It's going to be real important in all of the plagues. We have a total of 10 plagues. But when you look at the way they go through, they form 3 groups of 3 plagues and then a final 10th plague. And each of the group of 3 plagues all start with this phrase, in the morning. In the first 2 of the cycle, Moses will go to Pharaoh. In the last one in the cycle, he doesn't. And we're going to see this cycle repeated 3 times. But he's to go down to Pharaoh in the morning when he's going to the Nile. So this is a repeat of Moses being encountered by Pharaoh's daughter, right? Still at the Nile. He goes down there, and Moses is told to tell him, God says, let my people go. Let them go so they can serve me. And this command to serve me is the first time it's told to Pharaoh, and it will become the same refrain going through the plagues. We won't have this encounter at the beginning of the 10th plague. So what it shows us two things. Not just let my people go, you're being mean to them, but let them go so they can serve me. And if you do not let them go, not only are you oppressing them, but you're keeping my people from serving me. Moses was to tell Pharaoh that he was going to perform a sign so Pharaoh would know that the God of Moses was the Lord, and the sign was he would strike the Nile with a staff, and the Nile would turn to blood. And then the fish in the Nile would die, and the water would stink, which is confirmation that the water was now blood. It wasn't just red, it wasn't muddy, it was blood. Because fish can live in a lot of things, especially in fast-moving water. But what if the water suddenly turns to blood? Then nothing lives in it. And this is how you're going to know that our God is God. Now, what's interesting is that they do it, and the magicians come along, and they replicate the sign. My question is, where'd they get the additional water from? I don't know. But the other question is, who needs more blood? They can't undo what it is that God's done, but they can add to it. They can almost confirm by their own act. They're going to confirm what it is that God is doing. Now, because we do not have time, I don't have time to go through how each of the plagues is a judgment, not just on Pharaoh, not just on Egypt as a whole, but on a specific god within the Egyptian pantheon. We will see it later on where God goes, this is a judgment on Pharaoh, Egypt, and the gods of Egypt. But that is a worthwhile study. The Nile is one of their gods. Each of the ones, the frogs, the flies, the gnats, and so on, all relate to different gods or multiple gods within the Egyptian pantheon. But the Egyptians were in pain from this condition. They had to dig around the Nile for water to drink, and then the condition lasts for 7 days. Now, I'm going to mention something here that I don't have an answer to, but we can speculate pretty safely. Was Israel affected? We don't know for sure. But later on, we're going to find out that there is a difference in the mind of God between Gershom, where the Israelites are, and Egypt. And so it appears if things are going on in Egypt, they're not going on necessarily going on where the Israelites are. Later on, we'll be specifically told, this is happening here and it's not happening there. But these first couple, it just kind of doesn't say. But plague number 2, now we have frogs. And of all the ones, this one makes me laugh the most because just some idea about frogs everywhere just makes me start to laugh. But here's the fun part. Again, these are measures of deity. Because the frog pertains to a deity, the frogs cannot be killed. So as the second plague comes on, you need to let my people go so that they can serve me. If you don't, we're going to cover the land with frogs. They're going to come from the Nile, so back-to-back plagues involving the Nile, and they would go everywhere. They're going to go so much everywhere that you won't even be able to cook in the kitchen of your house without frogs being in the bowl. All right, that's going to be the image. But beyond just being gross everywhere, think about how disruptive this is. Because now every time you take a step, there's a chance you're going to twist your ankle because you're going to step on a frog. The frogs couldn't be killed. They couldn't do anything about this. And the magicians were able to do what? Repeat the feat. But again, who needs more frogs? But all they can do is confirm what God is already doing. So now Pharaoh asks for relief. He sends for Moses and Aaron. He says, ask the Lord on my behalf, and I will let the people go. Now, this particular cycle is going to happen in Exodus, Exodus 9, 10, and 12. So for each of these cycles, we're going to see one of these moments as well where he keeps asking for them to let it go. And then we have this weird back and forth. Moses says, okay, you choose when you want the frogs to go. Now, that's not the weird part. The weird part is this. Pharaoh goes, tomorrow. Now, that doesn't make any sense unless you consider how hard the heart of Pharaoh is. It's like a little kid that won't come out of the rain, and you tell them to come in, and you get them dried off, and they're just going to stand out in the rain and be mad at you. They will suffer this punishment for themselves in order for it. And this is what's going on with Pharaoh. And it'll almost become this weird ongoing joke in a couple of plagues where God goes, and this is going to happen tomorrow. And the relief is going to come tomorrow because you chose tomorrow when it came to the frogs. However it does, Moses calls upon the name of the Lord. The frogs leave the next day. And when Pharaoh sees the plague is over, he hardens his heart. All right. Again, important distinction. We need to memorize it. He didn't harden his heart. The heart wasn't mysteriously hardened, but Pharaoh purposefully, intentionally hardened his own heart. Now, gnats. Now, if frogs are the one to make me most laugh, this is the one I think would be the most annoying to me until we start getting into the hardcore plagues later on. Because this is what I think about whenever I think about this plague. Have you ever had a gnat fly up your nose? It's like the hardest thing to get rid of. It's like it's buzzing your whole brain. It's just driving you crazy. Now, think about this. Again, Moses is told to bring about this plague. He's not to go to Pharaoh this time. He goes back in plague 4. Remember, the last one of the cycle, he doesn't appear before Pharaoh. But the gnats are going to come, and they're going to be on everywhere and everything. And this time, the magicians are not able to repeat the plague. They can't make it stop, and they can't repeat it. And they tell Pharaoh that this is the finger of God, but Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He did not listen. Plague number 4, now the flies. This is an interesting one. It begins again with the command to rise in the morning. It tells us this is the next cycle of 3. But you're to go out there, repeat the command, let my people go that they may serve me. But if not, this is the consequence. God will send swarms of flies, and the houses of Egyptians will be full of swarms of flies, and there will be so many flies that the flies will cover the ground because there will not be enough room for them to fly in the sky. Now think about that. Have you ever had a fly buzzing around your hair, and every time it comes by, it like makes your eardrums start to rattle? How about so many flies that there's not enough room in the air for them all to fly, so they cover the ground? This many flies and this much buzzing is enough to change the air pressure around you. And it's going to fill the land. It's going to drive them absolutely bonkers. And then verse 22 says something unique. God will set apart the land of Goshen. There'll be no flies in Goshen, so God will know that he is with them. Now, it's the first division we're specifically told about. Again, does that mean they were affected or not affected by the previous plagues? We don't know. We can probably assume they were not. But Moses was to tell Pharaoh this is going to occur tomorrow, so now we have this kind of like God getting jabs in on him. It's coming tomorrow. You wanted to relief tomorrow. But the flies come, and we're told the land was laid waste. And the word is very similar to what we have in Genesis chapter 6 when God was looking at the world and how corrupt it is, and the earth was filled with violence. It's the same kind of thought process in the words. Pharaoh summons Moses a second time, right? All right, listen. Make the flies go away. And if you do this, you can worship your God, but do it in the land. Now, this is the voice of compromise of the world to the saint. You can worship God if you really want to. Just do it within our paradigm. Do it in a way that we can deal with. And Moses responds, we cannot, because if we worship God the way that we're going to be called to worship God, it's going to be repulsive in the sight of the Egyptians because we're going to have to sacrifice animals. So Pharaoh gives his counteroffer. Okay, you can go into the wilderness, but you must not go very far away. It's the next level of compromise. Okay, you don't want to keep it in your church house. All right, well, just don't go very far from there. Don't go too deep into the culture. Stay close enough that we can still get grips on you and you can worship your God. Moses says he will intercede on Pharaoh's behalf, but tells Pharaoh, do not deal deceitfully with the people. Moses keeps his part. God keeps his part. Pharaoh hardens his heart again. Chapter 9, plague 5. Oh, yeah, way too far. Okay, we're still... no. Okay, thank you. Disease on the livestock. Moses is told to go to Pharaoh, tell him to let God's people go so they can serve him. If he does not, God will send a very severe pestilence on the livestock. Now, this is an interesting moment as we start to go into this particular phase. Because this disease that's coming, this severe pestilence is heading the livestock, he's again going to make this distinction. But now we have death starting to enter into the field in a very, very strong way. He says, but I'm not going to affect the livestock of Israel. And it happens just as God says, and Pharaoh sends people to Goshen to see if their livestock was okay or not. And is told not even one of the livestock of Israel died. It becomes a clear sign. Death is now coming to the land. Our animals are dying, but theirs aren't. Not even a single one of their animals are dying. And in response to this, Pharaoh hardens his own heart again. Now here we start to pick up the emphasis on it. The ante is going up. God tells Moses and Aaron to take handfuls of soot from a kiln and throw it up into the air in the sight of Pharaoh. They're not talking to him this time. But what they're doing is visible to him. It's going to become like fine dust, which becomes boils on man and the beast. And the question we need to ask ourselves, well, why is he getting dust out of a kiln? Bricks are hardened in a kiln. You can definitely make sun-dried bricks. It will totally work. But if you need bricks strong enough to deal with the mammoth pressures on top of it, particularly if you're going to use them as foundation stones, they have to be heat-treated. And straw becomes this ancient form of rebar within the material to bind it together to keep it from drying out and becoming too loose. And it appears like, go get some of that dust that they use, this oppression that they put upon you. Cast it into the air, and it's going to become boils onto them. We're told that the magicians could not even stand before Moses because of the boils. And this becomes the last overt appearance of the magicians within the court of Egypt. Verse 12 is of critical importance. This is the first time that we're told that God hardens the heart of Pharaoh. And you want to ask yourself why? Because this one hits Pharaoh directly. When it comes to water being turned to blood, he has enough money and power to get water brought in. The frogs, he can have people clear them out of the palace. For the gnats and the flies, he can find ways to keep himself covered. The livestock are the ones being diseased, not the people, but now the boils come upon him. The impact comes upon him, and God goes, you don't get to get out of this one. You're going to experience this personally. And then plague 7, it begins the last set of threes. It begins within the morning. God again repeats the command, let my people go that they may serve me, and the consequences escalate. Let them go so that they may serve me, or I will send all my plagues upon you. Now, when you look one for one with the 10 plagues on Egypt, and then we go to the book of Revelation, and we look at the seal judgments, trumpet judgments, bowl judgments, we don't have a one for one per se with all of those. However, there is this feeling among the plagues of Egypt with each group of 3 where they become a little bit more intense and a little bit more fearful. And we see the same thing in the book of Revelation when it comes to the seal judgments, then the trumpet judgments, and then when the bowl judgments come. That's when the 3 woes start going into it. There seems to be this echo from the book of Exodus as well. But God gives a reason. This is why I'm going to send all my plagues on you, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. And it goes to answer the question of Pharaoh all the way back at the beginning. Who is God that I should let his people go? But God reveals his grace and restraint. He says, if I had struck you and your people with the pestilence instead of your livestock, all of you would be gone. And yet I kept you around so you would have the chance to repent. And if you repent and let my people go, or even if you don't, still my glory will come forward. But Pharaoh refuses to bend. And so God is going to send a hail so heavy, the like has never been seen before. But then he gives them grace. Even though this is going to be a terrible plague, we're going to have balls of ice, stones of ice coming down that's mixed with fire somehow. I mean, how ferocious and terrifying is that? But God says this, if you value your people and your livestock, then bring them in from the storm. I'm telling you, I'm going to send it. Anything that's outside is going to be consumed. But if you bring your animals in and your people in, you bring them into the house, they will all be safe. And now we have this breakdown in the response of the people of Egypt. Some fear God and brought their livestock in. Others did not, and their animal and people in the field dies. The hail comes. It's hail comes with fire flashing in the midst of hail. So does that mean that there's fire around the balls of ice as they come down? Is it balls of ice with fire on the inside of it? We have no idea. Whatever it is, it's terrifying. But it becomes a double picture of judgment, because the punishment for blasphemy is stoning. And fire is a picture of that purifying crucible that removes the wickedness and leaves only the righteous. However, in Goshen, there was no hail. Pharaoh sends for Moses and Aaron and says, I have sinned this once. While his memory is faulty, he does confess what's true. God is righteous. Me and the people are wicked. This time I'll let you go. Moses says he will intercede. The hail will stop, but he knows Pharaoh still does not fear the Lord. But the hail does stop. And it stops when Moses says it's going to stop so that everyone will know that all the earth is the Lord's. When Pharaoh saw that the plague ended, verse 34 says, he hardens his own hearts, both him and his servants. So now it's this entire group dynamic. It confirms that he chooses wickedness. And now, from now on, God will let him have the wickedness he has chosen, because for the rest of it, God will harden his heart. Verse 35 confirms that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not let Israel go, just as God told Moses what would happen. Plague number 8. God tells Moses he has hardened the heart of Pharaoh now. Pharaoh and the servants, so he could perform the signs among them. And so that Israel would have it declared to them clearly that God is the Lord. So Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and go, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before the Lord? But if you continue to relent, God will send locusts, so many they will cover the surface of the land so that no one will be able to see the land. And now here's the terrifying part. Not just that there's locusts coming, but they will eat whatever has escaped the hail. Now here's the idea. The hail comes through and it just decimates the crop, especially the ones that are in bloom and lifted up. Some of them weren't. We're even told that it was a season for this but not for that. But those plants are still growing. But anything that is still standing from the hail that they haven't had a chance to gather up yet is going to be eaten by the locusts. But here's the fun part. Locusts go everywhere. So whatever you have in the house or in the storehouse or in Pharaoh's house, the locusts can go there too. There's so many, they're going to cover the entire ground. There won't be spots where there won't be locusts, and they will eat everything not destroyed by the hail. It will leave the country destitute and almost an inversion of what it is that Joseph did, because he's the one that you guys forgot. The servants of Pharaoh start getting nervous, and they say, how long is this guy going to be a snare to us? Just let him go worship their God. Can't you see the country's destroyed? So he calls them and says, okay, all right, you can go serve. Enough's enough. So who's going? And Moses goes, everybody. And Pharaoh goes, watch out. Take heed. He says, I'll let the men go, but nobody else. It's a very, very tricky offer. It sounds good, right? Let the men go. They can go do men's stuff. But I know you won't leave because I'm not going to let you take your wives or your kids. I'm not going to let you take your families. So you'll have to come back. You'll have to come back for your people. Pharaoh agrees to this, and then he drives Moses and Aaron out before they're able to respond. And then here come the locusts. They're so numerous, we're told, verse 14, it'll never be surpassed in history. They cover the entire land, and they eat every plant so that nothing green was left in all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh sends for Moses, says, I have sinned, please forgive me this one time. It's very similar to his response after the hail in Exodus 9:27. And Moses intercedes on behalf of Pharaoh, and the Lord sends a very strong west wind which drives the locusts into the Red Sea. And it almost seems to be a foreshadowing of what God's going to do with the Egyptian army in Exodus chapter 14 when he sends a wind to blow it, and then he stops the wind and allows it to collapse. God hardens Pharaoh's heart after the relief, and then we have plague 9. Now, plague 9 is super interesting. It actually dovetails really well, Debbie, with the question you asked during Q&A about light being in the darkness, because this is the darkness that you can feel. So this isn't regular darkness. It's not just like an eclipse or something like that where the sun suddenly stops shining. No. What this is wickedness you can feel. This is evil upon the land because this is what you wanted. But here's the great thing. There's darkness in Egypt, but not where the Israelites are. It does not appear in Goshen. And while this darkness is upon the land, and it lasts 3 days, Pharaoh summons Moses, and he gives permission for Moses to take all the people, even your little ones. Go and worship God. Just leave your stuff here. Again, so clever. Because what this would have done, if he had let the people go, you can finally go. I mean, if you really want to, man, we'll find other slaves if we have to, but leave your stuff because we're going to take all your wealth and we're going to transfer it to us. And what it would do, it would leave them without any options and completely destitute out in the wilderness. And they would either have returned or perished with no money. Moses refused. He says, we can't compromise with any of this. We don't even know what we're going to need when we get to where God wants us to go. We have to take all of our stuff with us. And then specifically we were told God hardens the heart of Pharaoh and he responds with anger. And he tells Moses, if I ever see your face again, you're a dead man. Moses agrees. we will not see each other face to face. And this moment effectively ends any potential conversation or negotiation between Moses and Pharaoh, and this ends the third cycle of 3 plagues. Now, if this statement is true and not just Moses kind of speaking off the cuff, then it means the conversation that's recorded in Exodus chapter 12 between Moses and Aaron and Pharaoh is either done by messengers, or some of the conversations we're going to have in a moment are reflections of conversations that have already had. But for our purposes, this ends all negotiations between the two. Chapter 11. Now we have this very long break between the 9 plagues and the 10th one. God says, one more plague's coming. And after this last plague, Pharaoh will not only let you go, he's going to drive you out of the land. There will be no strings attached to this one. God tells Moses, when you go, you're to ask your neighbors for silver and gold. And it's a neat word that's used for it because Goshen is right next to mainland Egypt. And so they're going to go plunder their neighbors. They're going to ask their neighbors for silver and gold. And essentially what they're going to get is however many years of slavery, back pay. All the things that you earned off of our back, we're going to go get it and we're going to leave. And they're going to plunder the Egyptians on their way out. And by doing this, they will fulfill the word of the Lord, Exodus chapter 3. But he says this, the plague will come at midnight. I'm down in verses 4 through 7. The plague will come at midnight. The firstborn of Egypt will die from the Pharaoh to the lowest slave, even the cattle in the field. Now, there's no part of this you can look at and treat it lightly. The measure seems horrible. And it is. But this is what we need to remember. God told Moses in Exodus chapter 4, verse 22, Israel is my firstborn. And you're trying to oppress them and keep my firstborn from me. And if you try to do this to my firstborn, I will take your firstborn. Because the evil that you try to do, I will revisit back on you. God does not kill firstborns for the sake of it. All God does is give people what it is that they want. And what he's doing is giving to Pharaoh what Pharaoh wants. And if it looks evil, it's because it is. Because that's Pharaoh's heart's desire. Moses announced what the Lord told him. He's announcing it to Israel, not to the Egyptians. He's not talking to them anymore. Verses 8 through 10, we have this conversation between Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh, but again, it appears to be an old conversation. Maybe it's what happened at the end of chapter 10 when he made Moses get out of his presence. Chapter 12, we have the institution of the Passover. God's telling them, after this night, you guys will be free. This will now become the beginning of your calendar. It's where your life starts all over again. For a Christian, it's the moment that you're saved. It's when you start all over again. For our boys, we celebrate the day that they asked Jesus to be their Savior, and we call it their birthday in the Lord, and we treat it just like any other birthday. They get presents, they get to choose where we go to eat, the whole 9 yards. And that's what he's doing with them. They are going to celebrate this every single year, the year that you became brand new. This is the month of Nisan on the Jewish calendar, so it's our March and April. It kind of floats a little bit. It's like the last 2 weeks of March to the first couple of weeks of April. It moves a little bit because their calendar days are different than our calendar days. But he says in this month, this is what you're going to do. On the 10th day, I'm not sure why 10 days, not first day, but anyway, on the 10th day, you're going to pick out a lamb. And here's the specifics. An unblemished male, 1 year old, can come from the sheep or the goats. Don't know why it can come from both, but that's the rules. Then on the 14th day, you will kill that sheep at twilight. So days 10 through 14, your family's going to get real attached to the sheep. The kids will feed it. You'll be close to it. It's still in that place where it's cute because it's not adult sheep, which are disgusting and ugly. But on the 14th day, your family will kill this sheep. And you will collect the blood from its carcass. And you're going to take some of that blood from the lamb and you're going to put it on the doorposts and lintels. So the framework of the door of the house that you're going to eat it. So it's not your neighbor's house, but we're all going over to Bob's house. No, the house that you eat it in, that's the house that gets the blood. You're going to put it over that house, and then once the family goes inside that house, nobody goes back out. We're not like, oh, well, no, it's on my house, I'm good. No, you stay inside the house because only that area is protected. Only that fellowship that's observing this is going to be protected. You're going to eat the flesh of the lamb that same night, the night that it is killed. is the night that you eat it. The night that it is sacrificed for you is the night that you take it in. You don't go, well, I recognize what this sheep has done for me, but I'm just going to wait for a little while. I'll eat it as leftovers later on. No, you partake of it right then, that night, and you leave none of it till the following morning. The lamb was to be roasted with fire, not eaten raw, not boiled. Why roasted with fire? Because the fire is the sign of that purifying crucible that Israel and Jesus will go through. It is to be eaten with unleavened bread. Later on, unleavened bread will be understood to be a picture of sinless sacrifice. But it's not mentioned here. We won't really see that picture of unleavened bread till we get to the New Testament when Jesus describes it, and later on when Paul expounds upon it. All they understand right now that is part of the rules. We don't eat leaven. Make sure there's no leaven inside of the house. And this isn't even the first mention of unleavened bread. The first mention of unleavened bread is Genesis 19, when Abraham makes a meal for God and the two angels when they're going to Sodom. He says, you're to eat this lamb roasted with fire, with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs. Why the bitter herbs? Because this is what the lamb had to survive on until they were finally released. The lamb that was the sacrifice was going to have to take this. It would be roasted with fire, delivered with unleavened bread, and served along bitter herbs, speaking to the bitter pain that they were delivered from, that this one would take upon itself. They were to eat this meal dressed to go, even though they're going to eat it later into the night. Remember, the plague is going to come at midnight. Your loins will be girded, your sandals on your feet, the staff in your hand. You're to eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. The idea is powerful and strong. You are going to be delivered from Egypt. Don't hang around. You're done with this place. We're out. Why would you want to stay here? The declaration that the 10th plague is coming in verses 12 through 13. God will judge the firstborn of Egypt because they represent the strength and the future of Egypt. That's an idea to hold on to later. We'll discuss it at another time. The judgment is difficult and harsh. There's no way around it. But God gives the authority that allows him to judge, or he proclaims the authority that allows him to judge Egypt in this way. And he says this, I am the Lord. Now, there's no part of that feels satisfying to our flesh. But it's the same thing we discussed in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God. Why does he get to declare what is good and what is evil, what is light and what is darkness? Because he's God. Because before there was a beginning, he was there. Why can he do this? Because he's the Lord. And he understands that doesn't feel very satisfying for us. But still, he will protect his people from the plague by the blood on the doorposts and lintels. And he says specifically, when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. He doesn't say it here, so I will go ahead and say it because I know it's one of those things that I struggle with. Remember how the book of Exodus started. Remember what Pharaoh's great plan was to keep Israel from overcoming the land. The image of children being killed by the womb by their own countrymen, of children being thrown into the Nile to be drowned so they wouldn't pose a threat. Do we really want to judge the goodness of God depending on what he's doing here when this is what they have visited upon themselves? He doesn't give them something foreign to them. All he does is give them what they sowed. God tells them, after this day, you're now going to have a feast of unleavened bread. We won't have it this time because we're going to be on the move, but hereafter, there will be an annual feast, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It will be a permanent ordinance. And what it will be is 7 days of annual celebration that you were delivered from the oppression of Egypt. You will not eat any leaven. That's the focus of it. And anyone who eats leaven during that period of time will be cut off from the land, so either a break in fellowship or executed. We're not really sure. The context isn't super clear for us. But you're going to observe this every year, because on this day, God brought you out of Egypt. Now, Moses tells the instructions to Israel. When it comes to the feast, he says, you're going to do this every year. Now, please look at verse 26. This is so important. Why are you going to do this? Because someday your children are going to ask you, what do we do this for? We'll see this later on with the redemption of the firstborn. You're going to do this, not because I need the stuff, I need the sacrifice. You're going to do this because your kids are going to ask, why are we doing this again? And you're going to tell them, we are doing this because this is what the Lord has done for us. You remember something we saw throughout Genesis? What the son sees the dad do, the son does too. God takes the same dynamic and he redeems it for himself. What the son sees the dad doing righteousness, the son does too. Your children are going to ask about this. And because of you following what I have placed before you, they're going to know me too. This is a redeeming aspect of what we saw before. But it becomes this crescendo throughout the books of Moses, and we'll see it at its highest point in the book of Deuteronomy. The people respond by bowing low, worshiping, doing all that was commanded. Verses 29 through 30, the 10th plague comes, and there's almost no verses that really describe it. Pharaoh sends word to Moses and Aaron. He says, take the people and go. Take your flocks, take your herds, and bless me too. If you remember way back when, from Genesis, when Jacob first went before Pharaoh, as Joseph led him into the room, the first thing he does to him, he comes to him, he shows respect, but then he blesses Pharaoh. The greater always blesses the lesser. Now here's the closing idea coming out of it. With the people going out of the land, another Pharaoh says, bless me too. The Egyptian people urge the Israelites to go. They give them whatever they ask for. They ask for silver and gold and clothing. Thus they plundered the Egyptian. We're told 600,000 men left. We talked about the full population numbers that probably meant to, and that also a mixed multitude went with them. It's likely Egyptians who said, I don't know what's going on, but you guys clearly have God with you, so we're going to go too. Or there are other people groups that were also in Egypt, also in slavery or some kind of servitude, so they all go as well. It's actually going to be a big problem later on. But verses 40 through 42, we have the recap of the captivity. They were in captivity for 430 days, and at the end of that time, to the very day, verse 41, they were delivered. It shows that God had a plan and a timetable. And then at the end of chapter 12, the Passover ordinance is repeated. In chapter 13, God asserts his claim over the firstborn. Now remember, you put blood on the lintel, and I'm going to pass over. Hey, that sounds great. But he goes, not so fast. Now all those kids that I spared, all the firstborn of both the people and the animals, they now belong to me. But again, he's delivering them from something into something else. But the placement of this demand is very important. It comes after the deliverance from the 10th plague. He doesn't say it beforehand and include this idea of a threat. Boy, if you don't put that blood on there, he says, you do this. I'm going to pass over you. I show the mercy first. I take the sacrifice first. I show you the grace first. But now here's the expectation after that. They belong to me. They're mine. Why? Because you want more slaves, God? Not at all. But because I'm going to protect them. They're my kids. This is my strength now, my nation of Israel. The placement is so important. It comes after the institution of the annual feast as well, this reminder about how they're to celebrate what it is that God has done for them. But then he goes back into the feast again, an annual reminder of the claim of God over the firstborn. Moses tells the people there to remember this day. Verses 8 and 9 are important because they confirm that Passover is more than just an event. It's a message to the people. Because again, we have this idea, you will tell your son on that day that he asks you, what is this about? It's because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. Again, it's all in the same place. It's going to testify of the goodness of God. God emphasizes his claim over the firstborn. He says when the firstborn animals or the firstborn animal is born, what should you do? If it's a clean animal, it's to be sacrificed on the altar. If it's an unclean animal, you either redeem the animal by offering a clean animal in its place, or, we'll see later on, you have to break its neck. You don't get to do this with your kids. He says, you will redeem your children for a set price. All right? Well, you'll have an offering that you have to do. God makes it so that there's economic tiers in it, so wherever you are on the economic schedule, you'll be able to offer a sacrifice that won't break the bank. He makes it possible for everyone to follow this ordinance. But it's interesting because how did the whole book start with the idea of the Egyptians taking the children of Israel and killing them for the Egyptians' convenience? And God goes, you don't get to kill your kids even for your convenience. You will surely redeem the children. And then you will teach them these lessons by these annual feasts. The children were to be redeemed, could not be sacrifices, and they could not discard a child due to convenience. The reason for the sacrifice was so when their children would ask about the practice, when they brought these animals or they were going to offer these sacrifices for them, they'd go, why are we doing this again? Because this is what the Lord did for us. It's to serve as a sign, and God leads the people personally. Now, as they're going, we're told Moses takes the bones of Joseph, and that God will lead the Israelites by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Now, we're told that the pillar of fire was a pillar of fire by night so they could walk by day or night. That makes a lot of sense. Again, if you've seen the movie, you have the image in your head. The pillar of fire is kind of interesting. Is it a reference to the smoking oven from Genesis and the covenant that God made with Abraham? Some scholars think that maybe what was going on is, because the word is a bit nebulous between cloud and smoke, that the idea is that it's a pillar of smoke or cloud that goes up and then it spreads like a giant cloud over the nation, 2.4 million people. And it acts like a giant sun umbrella over the people. So as they're going through the wilderness and the Middle Eastern sun is beating down on top of them, it's not sapping them of all of their energy. God himself is taking the heat of the sun to provide them with a little rest and ease as they go through. Don't know, but it's an interesting image. He leads them this way. We're told he will lead them this way all the way until they're in the promised land. It's a wilderness-specific manifestation by God, though. All right, 2 more chapters. I know I'm holding you long, but stay with me. Chapter 14. They're already on their way. God is speaking, taking them by kind of a circuitous route. He gives you a rationale in the previous chapter. I won't go into it now. But God says, Moses, Pharaoh's coming. He's coming because he's going to look at you and he's going to assume that you're lost out in the wilderness. And the purpose is to chase you, this purpose is not just to chase you out of the land, but I'm going to allow him to come so we can handle the threat once and for all, so they can't come after you later, to glorify my name among Pharaoh and the army, and to seal shut your desire to return back to the land. To show you they're never going to take you back. The only reason they would ever take you back is to oppress you. Look, here they come with their chariots. They're coming to destroy you and to take you back to slavery. So Pharaoh chases after them. He hears the Israelites have fled, and when he hears about the route that they went, how they fled, he says that we're told the Pharaoh and his servants have a change of heart. Now, here's the interesting thing. It's not because they suddenly have this desire for revenge, which would make sense to me. If all our firstborn kids were suddenly gone, and I said, they're lost, and I'm filled with anger, and I'd kind of like a little payback. That would actually make sense in my head, but that's not why they go. Because again, they will sacrifice the young for their convenience. Instead, we see this. They go, why did we let them stop serving us? They chase them out of selfishness. Who's going to serve us now? So we're told he goes after them. He takes 600 select chariots, plus all the other chariots too. And then they go and they overtake Israel while they're beside the sea. Now, I'm going to touch on this super fast, and we'll go through it some more as we go through the text. But there's a lot of argument over whether this was the big Red Sea that you see on the map, or is this a word for the Reed Sea? And the Reed Sea is more of a marshy area, about 8 inches of water. And the old joke among Bible scholars is, well, if it is the Reed Sea, then that's the greater miracle, because then God somehow drowned the entire Egyptian army in about 8 inches of water. But throughout the moment is laced the idea that this is a great body of water, and it starts with this here. He overtakes them by the sea, and the word for sea means roaring. It's the idea of the sea pounding upon the rocks and the shore. A lot of activity, a lot of power in it, and this is where he overtakes the nation. When the people see Pharaoh, they become fearful. They cry out against Moses. Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Why'd you bring us out here, make us move all our stuff just to get us killed in the desert? The fear shows how well God knows the people, why he brought them the way that he brought them. And again, that's a reference to something that we didn't cover, but it is in the text why he brought them this way. But Moses responds, and these are beautiful words, unbelievably strong. He says, do not fear. Behold, the salvation of the Lord who fights for you. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. Beautiful words. It doesn't appear he believed a one of them. Because then he goes off by himself to talk to God, and he seems to be crying out to God because God goes, why are you crying? Go do what I told you to do. Go lift up your staff like I told you to do it, and behold my deliverance for you. Moses is told, go lift up your staff, hold out your hands, similar to what's going on with some of the plagues. And the idea in this moment is that it's still going to be the power of God, but when it was in the plagues, it was the power of God to judge and to free, and here it's the power of God to deliver his people. And as he does this, God is going to send a wind, and it's going to split the land. It's going to divide the land, and the people will go through the sea on dry land. God tells Moses, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians. They are going to pursue you as soon as I give them a chance. So don't be scared when you see this. Don't cry to me again. But I'm doing this for a purpose. I'm going to lead them to their judgment. God moves first. He always moves first. He moves first. He sends the angel, the pillar, from the front of the camp. Remember, because it was leading them. Now he puts it at the rear of the camp, and it acts as a barrier between the people and the Egyptian army. Now, here's the interesting thing. We're told it's a pillar of cloud. That means this is during the day. However, the pillar of cloud is to the Egyptians darkness. But to all night long, to Israel, it's going to be light for them to go. It's a powerful dynamic between the two. Again, he's just giving them what they asked for. They're coming with evil. Here's evil upon your head. You're coming after me. I'm going to have you with light and show you your deliverance. The sea parts, God splits the waters by sending a strong east wind all night. The wind not only parts the water, but dries the land, conceivably. The Israelites go through on dry land, and we're told that the water on either side of them become like walls. It speaks of a height and a stiffness. Again, there's a depth to this idea. You don't need walls on either side of you when the water's only 8 inches deep. You just need a little path or a land bridge. But whatever this is going on, it is powerful enough that the dynamics is steady, that he has to keep the walls at bay. The Israelites go through the sea on dry land, and eventually at the morning watch, verse 24, the morning watch, the Egyptians were allowed to resume the pursuit. They go into the midst of the sea, and God caused their wheels to start to swerve, and they're going with difficulty. Israel got to go through on dry land. But it was such hard going for the Egyptians that they shouted that they should flee because the Lord is fighting for the Egyptians. Now, Moses is told to stretch out your hands again, okay? They get through the other side. You opened your hands, you stretched out your hands, and the sea was split. Now, I want you to do it again, but this time I'm going to take away the wind. I'm going to allow the sea to go back. And it doesn't go back and mound up, and all the water from the world came onto it. It's told it just goes back to its normal level. Again, it speaks of depth. A depth so great that when all of it crashes down upon you, you're not going to be able to swim to the top. And this happens as daybreak. As the sun starts going up, the water comes down, and not a one of them remained, those who went into the sea. Verse 28 and 29 shows the contrast between the two groups. The Egyptians were consumed by the sea, but the Israelites passed through as on dry land. And verse 30 is the conclusion. Thus the Lord saved Israel. Chapter 15, last one. Here we have the song of Moses. It's a beautiful song, very, very poetic. It shows how gifted Moses was in so many areas. It's not the only song of Moses we'll have. We'll have another one at the end of Deuteronomy, near the end of his life. But I'm going to point out just a few verses as we start to close. Verse 1, when he says, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and his rider he has hurled into the sea." This will be repeated by Miriam in verse 21 when she goes and they do a chorus with the ladies, but she's leading them. And this will be a verse that's repeated by them. In verse 2, God is called my strength, my song, my salvation. You see that word for salvation in verse 2? It's a beautiful verse. But that word for salvation is the Hebrew word Yeshua, which in English is transliterated as Joshua, and in the Greek, Jesus. My God is Jesus. In verse 5, Moses records the Pharaoh's army is in the deep. So again, there's this idea of depth. It's not a little swamp. It's a deep sea. Wherever it's located, it's a deep sea. Verse 11, Moses asks, "Who is like our God, majestic in holiness, awesome in praise, working wonders to behold?" Verse 13, Moses declares that God led his people who he redeemed in loving kindness. He's guided them to God's holy habitation. And that verse is important, verse 13, because it combines all of the miracles they've seen so far to a future leading of Israel to God's holy habitation. Not just theirs, to God's holy habitation. It could be a reference to Mount Sinai. It is most likely a reference to Mount Zion, where Jerusalem is, where God will place his habitation. Verse 14 through 16, Moses declares the people will hear about this and tremble. And then in verse 20 and 21, we have Miriam's song. Now, we're told in verse 20 that Miriam is a prophetess. It's confirmed in Numbers 12 when Miriam speaks out against Moses and says, "Hey, you know what? God's spoken through us too." We also know from Micah chapter 4 that Miriam, along with Moses and Aaron, had positions of responsibility in the nation of Israel. But we need to understand when she's called a prophetess, it doesn't mean that she's able to declare the future. That's not the meaning of prophecy. It can sometimes include that, but that's not the meaning. The meaning of a prophet is someone who speaks the words of God as they are anointed. That's what's going on, that God will place his words upon the tongue and the heart. And since this is the first time that we see a woman specifically called a prophetess, and this is what she's doing, she is declaring words of something that just happened, not future events. She's declaring what just happened in words worthy of the glory of God. She is praising him in their presence, and it confirms that she was doing this by the will of God, that she is a prophetess. The song ends, they go on to the bitter waters of Elim, and we're almost done now. Remember when I asked you, Moses said, let my people go. God said, let my people go 3 days into the wilderness. 3 days into the wilderness. What do they find when they go 3 days into the wilderness? No water. Now, this is where he asked them to go. 3 days in the wilderness, surely we'd be okay, right? And what they find is a place that they still can't survive on their own. And the first water they're able to come in contact with is a water so bitter that it makes them sick. Later on, we're going to learn when they drink this water that God is going to be able to heal those who became violently ill from drinking the bitter water. And the people are upset and they start to grumble at Moses. Now, this is a murmuring. Later on, we'll understand there's a high contention and a soft murmuring. This is the soft murmuring. They're grumbling at Moses, and Moses cries out to the Lord, and God shows him a tree. He says, cut down that tree, throw it into the water. The waters will become sweet. Verse 25 and 26 tells us that God did this in order to test them, to demonstrate to them that if they obey his commands, that he would keep them from the plagues that were put on Egypt, for he is their healer. Now, here's the image, and this is what we're going to close with. The image is beautiful. You're going with God. He tells you to go this far out. You get there, and all you find is more bitterness. But he says, cut down this tree. For the Christian, take this cross and place it in the midst of the bitter waters that I am asking you to drink. And if you do this, if you go through the trial through the lens of the cross of Christ, I will take the bitter water and I will make it sweet. And what was once bitter and is now sweet will actually heal your soul. And this is what they find 3 days in the wilderness. The healing power of God. And from here, they can continue them on to Elim. They were at Marah, but continue them on to Elim, which seems to be an oasis. It's a place known for its springs and its trees. Father, we love you. Thank you for your grace. It was so much, Lord. Father, I give you praise and thanks for the people willing to sit here and go through this. But Father, they definitely do not come for anything I have to say because they are hungry for your word. That's why they press in. So, mighty God, we give you praise for your words that can alone satisfy us in this way. There are so many things in it. My mind just explodes with the fullness of it. So, Father, we beg you, may your Holy Spirit wash fresh upon us. Plant deep in our heart just that we need to know. Let it all be for our betterment as we try to grow stronger in you, taller towards you, but you know we can't do it at all. Just like the Israelites in the wilderness, all we find is bitterness. But if only we would put Christ in the center, it would be for our good. So help us to do exactly that. Lord, we love you so much. Be with us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.